Welcome, witches, wizards, and muggles alike, to another enchanting episode of Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room, bringing your favorite Harry Potter fan fiction to audio format. So sit back, relax, and Accio headphones and let the magic begin. Hello, Greenlight, Chapter 12. We do have a content warning for anxiety and implied references to suicide, so please take care and mind those warnings. So let's get started. Chapter 12. I suspect the light will be akin to coming up for breath after drowning, or rather, similar to a hand slowly dipping one's head into the black water. A resurrection of sorts, or perhaps a rebirth. Sophia Al-Jabbar, 1915. She can't sleep, tossing and turning to the sounds of the waves crashing and the rain pattering against the window pane. She moves up and off her bed and paces around the room. She clutches the roots of her hair and squeezes her eyes shut. She's warded the room to silence the sounds of the storm, but lightning still flashes brilliantly, creating ominous shadows against the walls. Her conversation with Malfoy and the memories of the war run on a looped reel in her head. It's dangerous to take a sleeping draught when she's this distressed. She'd be placing herself in the hands of a disruptive sleep. So instead, she tries arithmancy, and she does rebirth calculations in her mind. Tries to put herself in a stance as she follows ruins and patterns over and over in her head. But 2 a.m. rolls around, and the combination of the storm and the constant replay of the war in her mind forces her to open the side drawer, unscrew the flask, and down the remainder of the potion. Within seconds, or perhaps it's hours, Hermione doesn't know. Her body melts into the bed, her limbs heavy, and she mercifully falls asleep. Hermione threw a stinging curse at Harry, his face swelling immediately. Greasy hands grabbed her, and Ron let out a groan in pain. She tried to tug herself loose, lurching towards Ron's curled body, shrieking, "Leave him alone!" She heard the sound of a hand slapping across her cheek before her head snapped to the right. "Be quiet." A nauseatingly hot voice growled near her face. The unknown man wrapped his burly hand around her hair and viciously yanked her head back. Tears pricked against her eyes and a burning pain spread across her cheek. She's tried so hard. Weeks and weeks in a tent, walking endless distances, trying to figure out where the Horcruxes were. She missed the comfort of the burrow, longed for the warmth of a home-cooked meal in front of a fireplace, ached for her parents' arms around her. She wanted her parents. She wanted to go home. But then the shadowed figures were pulling Harry up close, and she heard a familiar voice, Greyback, saying something about summoning Voldemort, and Hermione's heart leapt out of its cage. Greyback. She couldn't stop now. She had to do something, had to protect Harry. Harry was everything, above her, above any pain or exhaustion she felt. They were still focused on Harry, trying to figure out who it was underneath the puppiness. Potter's mudblood was thrown around by the others as they took her in, but she fixated on the hands pushing Harry's fringe back to look at the now deformed scar. She had one chance, one shot at this, because once they began running, it would only confirm their suspicions. She didn't think twice. "Stupefy!" she yelled at Greyback, and Harry stumbled back, moving away from the werewolf's falling, frozen body. There was confusion amongst the others, but she was already throwing another curse, yanking Harry to his feet. Ron clambered towards them, pure shock across his face as he gazed at her. She only said one thing, "Run." And then they were moving. Not looking back, feet snapping twigs and leaves under their shoes, red-white curses shot at them, and Hermione tried to shoot counter curses back, twisting her body around, demanding her feet to continue moving. Her heart was a drum, breath sharp and heavy. Run, 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 run! She had no plan, nothing, other than solitary thought to protect Harry. Greyback shifted into a wolf, snapping at Harry's legs, and Hermione threw another curse at the beast. Harry managed to get in front of her, where she could keep her eyes on him, but with his swollen eyes, he couldn't see. With horror, she watched as he tripped, and she cried out, charging towards him, praying she'd reach him in time. Hermione jolts upright in bed, panting for air. She's blinded in the darkness, and panic floods her blood. Harry. Where is Harry? Suddenly, she's jumping out of her bed, bedroom door slamming open and her wand in her hand. She sprints down the creaking stairs, stumbling on the last step. She falls to the floor when she loses balance and her knees bark in pain. She's already up before she can even process what's happening. She needs to find Harry. If Harry falls, Greyback will get him, and then they'll be taken to Voldemort. Hermione can't let that happen. Too much has happened for it to end like this. She's unaware of how she gets outside. Doesn't even stop to think about what she's doing when the cold breeze slaps at her face. Instantly, she's soaked, rain slamming against her like steady hail. She doesn't even feel the freezing wetness of her clothes. She's barefoot, running down the steps and into the trees. "Harry!" she calls out, her voice drowned in the downpour of the rain and the roar of the waves. Her feet carry her through trees. Her hands somehow manage to push away branches that ricochet against her arms. The trees blur into the blackness of the night as she runs, a flash of white, and then there's a voice, someone yelling. Greyback, or Scabier. They'd found her. They will find Harry if she doesn't get to him first, and she can call out for Ron, cry out for his help. Where the hell is Ron? Why is she here alone? Granger! She trips at the familiarity of the voice, the way it vibrates in her blood. Knees crack as she hits the ground once again. Nails dig into the damp dirt as she hauls herself to her elbows, grunting in pain, and back to her feet. Granger! Harry, she whispers, delirious. His name is a mantra. Her purpose. She barely registers the movement behind her, but she doesn't look back, only forward. She wavers slightly as she tries to find her footing before starting to run once more. Granger! Harry, she calls out in response to her name. It's Harry who's calling her. It must be. He's looking for her, so she runs to where she hears the loudest sounds, roars and crashing. She hardly makes it far before someone yells out behind her. Mobilis! Hermione freezes. Blood, heart, bones all stop in time. No, 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 no. And then she's falling backwards, like a toppled chess piece into the cold, wet mud. She doesn't feel the crash of her body. Perhaps she's cushioned by the thick mud. But then she's being levitated upwards, feet leaving the ground, and she realizes she never hit the ground. She never falls, because somehow she's in the air. Her head is twisted to the left from when she was looking around for Harry. There's nothing except for trees and darkness. Rain falls on her face, getting to her eyes, but she can't blink it away. She doesn't know if they're tears from being stuck or from her own vulnerability that mix into the rain on her cheeks. She tries to channel her magic to reverse the spell, but she's positively frozen in the air, and she wants to scream into nothingness at how helpless she feels. And still, despite her entire body being locked, eyes glazed over by darkness, she can't help but think of Harry. This is all her fault, because she made the wrong call. She should have figured out another plan, something other than running blind. How did this happen? How did it get like this so quickly? Why is it always so hard for them to do anything? She can die here, she thinks. There will be nothing now, and it's relief. It's easier to succumb to the perils of the darkness if it's already night. But there's a flash of white in the corner of her eyes, and then warm, strong hands wrap around her waist. They slide up from her waist to just below her ribcage as if trying to find a grip. The heat from the touch seeps through her clothes and into her cold skin. She feels herself descend back down, and her feet touch the ground once more. The hands squeeze around her body once, as if to make sure she's not about to fall backwards and drop away. Air inflates her lungs, and she jumps back, whirling around to face her opponent. Malfoy, she breathes. Her wand falters for a second as she stares in confusion, but anger washes over her as she realizes just what he's done, and she steadies her aim. How dare you, she seethes and takes a step towards him. She's unnerved by how exposed she made herself to someone, and her body crackles with adrenaline preparing her for a fight. Dread is replaced by the electricity coursing through her veins, lighting her nerve endings. She's all fire now that the ice is gone. Malfoy doesn't even move, simply studies her. His wand is relaxed by his side. The sight of his signature cool indifference only flares her anger more, and she takes another step closer. What the hell are you doing? She demands. Saving your life, apparently, he replies dryly. You're welcome, by the way. Hermione blinks and glances around. She's struck by the sensation of detachment from her environment and tries to orient herself. She can't figure out why she's outside at this time, but the sounds of the wave make her turn around. She gasps. Her heart sinks. They're near the edge of the cliff, looking over the ocean. Waves crash violently against the jagged edges of the cliff. Close. She was so close to running right off and plummeting into the darkness. The thought gives an odd sense of clarity that makes her remember what happened. It lasts less than a moment when another thought follows it, and her body shakes in horror. She gulps down the uneasiness in her stomach, placing one palm against her forehead. She would have died because of a dream. What are you doing? Malfoy asked from behind her. I called you, but you kept running. She shivers against the cold wind, her wet t-shirt sticking to her skin. You called for Potter. His voice is close, somehow reaching her through the loud noise of the ocean and the rain, soft and traced with something that she knows can't be concern. It's odd enough to hear him like this that she's jarred back to the present. She spins around and raises her wand. You had no right. His brows raise. You're not fucking serious. She's scared. She almost died because she hadn't been able to differentiate reality from nightmare. But being terrified is not an option for her, especially not in front of Malfoy, not when she's already shown how vulnerable she is by needing him to step in. She doesn't want to admit to her foolishness or talk about how Hermione no longer knows what is real and what isn't. She deserves this, she thinks. For all the horrible things she's done in her life, her parents, the death in the war, the lies, the selfishness, this should happen to her. She's a hypocrite for preaching the healing of others when she isn't getting the help she needs. But that wasn't always true. She wanted to get better, and her mental health was one of the many things she wanted to heal. Except she quickly found her mind was nothing like treating her body. It couldn't get better with a recurrent diagnostic test or potions. It required patience and the help and guidance of a trained healer. It required for her to understand where she hurt and what the problem was. She couldn't very well point to her chest, head, bones, or blood and say, here is where it hurt, everywhere. There was no open wound, no gushing blood for her to show. She had to talk and explain all the details, and that's where the wall was drawn. Because how was Hermione supposed to talk about her fractured mind? What was she supposed to say about how she detested all the smiling faces and the adoration she got from those around her? How could she say that she was sad and hurt and in grief when she was celebrated for the very source of those emotions? Somehow, under the requirements of being an Auror, Harry had managed to find a healer that worked for him. He suggested a few names, even recommended his own, but the thought of a healer that knew his story and then heard hers was mortifying. What were her concerns in the light of Harry's trauma? What had she suffered compared to him? She simply couldn't put it into words that she wished she was anyone else but her. She didn't want pity. She didn't want contempt even more. She was ungrateful for things that others wished for, but she didn't want to be hated for it. At one point, she thought maybe she could go to the Muggle healer, a therapist or psychologist, but she was at a loss of what to say to them. She didn't know how to explain the parts of her life, the way she was destroyed by a war, to a Muggle healer who was completely unaware of it even happening. She could have changed the words, lied, or made up stories for how she felt. Sorrow and grief were universal feelings that didn't depend on context. But she also couldn't live another double life, tiptoeing around her truth and constantly making sure to choose the right words and not slip. She still hadn't given up. Hermione turned to books like she always did. She went to a Muggle bookstore and found all the self-help books she could find. She picked up the books of women who faced their own wars and came out on the other side, smiling at their bright future filled with possibilities. She read all about self-discovery and healing through self-care and self-love, but it felt superficial and detached, as if someone was talking at her and highlighting all the parts of her life that were wrong and that she needed to fix through X, Y, and Z. She tried, but Hermione found that the desire to get better was limited by the desire itself, and eventually she stopped caring. Eventually it no longer mattered because she could feign ignorance if she distracted herself with everything else. She had bigger things to focus on. Her body was its own war, so she focused on the wounds that could heal right away with a potion or two. The parts of her body that healers could objectively see were wrong, and she fixed those. She filled her life with work and little projects that reminded her that others still needed her, and if she did whatever she could for them, she wouldn't have to worry about what she should do for herself. All of it, it seemed, was for nothing. The torch in the night she ignored came back to burn once more. She deserves this, but she doesn't want this. But it felt real, hadn't it? She felt the throat-gripping panic that had convinced her Harry was in danger. She felt Scabier's sour breath on the back of her neck. It had all been so familiar, so like what had happened then, that her body had reacted as though she was reliving those memories, and yet it was just a dream. She looks up at Malfoy, who tilts his head. She can't stand his quizzical look on him, as if she's a problem meant to be solved, and she's a hypocrite for that too. So she reaches deep inside for another familiar feeling, a protective cloak around her. Anger is normal with Malfoy, something she can work with, and it swarms all her senses as she puts her devastation to the back of her mind. She's irrationally livid by his audacity to stun her. He takes a step closer to her, wet blonde hair whipping in the cold air. His black long-sleeved shirt is soaked to his skin, clinging to the smooth planes of his body. She raises her wand again, ignores the slight tremble in her hand. Do not Come closer, Malfoy. He stares at her for a second and lets out a humorous laugh, shaking his head, disbelief stark across his face. You're actually serious. I fucking saved your life, Granger. She lifts her chin. I didn't ask you to. Yeah, well, it was kind of hard not to do it. Accessory to the fact and all. And also, Death Eater, it wouldn't have looked good for me, he retorts, crossing his arms against his chest. Her eyes fall to the muscles she's able to make out despite the dark rippling across his shirt. There's a lightness to him that she can't understand, as though he's dropped a load only for her to pick it up. Was their last discussion so far ago that he's changed completely? No, so it was circumstantial, she says. His eyes flash. You running through the forest this late in the storm with no shoes, you were going to jump off the cliff if I hadn't stopped you. She doesn't say anything and looks away from his arms to focus on the shaking trees behind him. She runs her palm down her face. I'm losing my mind. You're not, Malfoy says firmly, making her glance at him. You're not losing your mind. What I don't need from you right now, Malfoy, is pity. He shakes his head. I'm not pitying you. You said... He shakes his head again. I shouldn't have said it. I don't pity you. Pity I could handle. He waves a hand between them. Then whatever this is. She doesn't understand. She also doesn't care to understand. Were you, he wavers, his voice hesitant, when he tries again. Were you trying to jump? Don't be daft, she snaps. She lowers her wand and stalks past him. Daft, he sputters. I'm being daft? You almost died, Granger. She shifts her head to hide the wince. It's ridiculous, you know, to not appreciate when someone saves your life. The least I could get is a thank you, Malfoy. Fuck you, Malfoy. The words came out of her before she even thinks of them. She faces him, shocked and ready to apologize, but he lets out a short, brisk laugh, and it shuts her up immediately. She scowls. I'm glad someone finds this funny. Reckon there's an award for saving the Golden Girl? I should push you off the cliff. He shrugs. You could try. Her heart leaps at the idea, and she eyes the distance between him and the edge of the cliff. She taps her wand against her thigh and contemplates. His sneer flickers, eyes widening slightly as she calculates. She raises her wand, and he straightens, lips quirked up. There's a deep rumble behind her, and Hermione's head snaps in its direction. Her pulse quickens, yet everything around her slows down, weighing her body to where she's standing. She looks at the gray storm cloud far away, and she can't shake the feeling that she's stepped outside of her body. One singular cloud, and she can't look away, sinking into the ground until she disappears forever. Granger. Malfoy shifts into view, forcing her to look away from the hazy cloud and at him. It stopped raining, she realizes. A dense layer of humidity is left in the wake of the storm. Malfoy's brows furrow as he searches her face. Why were you running? She hesitates. It was just a nightmare. Has it happened before? I don't know. Why don't you take a dreamless drought? She shakes her head. I can't. He rolls his eyes in an insufferable way. There are no points for suffering, Granger. No one is grading you on how resilient you can be. That's not what I meant. She glares at him, but it's weak, and she sighs, resigned. It's the only way I can see them. Who? She pauses and waits expectantly. She isn't sure how much to share with him, how vulnerable she wants to be, considering how he acted before. She could use his own words on him and tell him to stay away, and he might listen, since none of this actually matters to him. But she's also tired, and after this last conversation, she feels disoriented. She also knows something compels him to her, making him pretend to care about what she has to say. She replies as evenly as she can. My parents. He stiffens. You dream about them? Yes. Do you dream about the war? Sometimes. And the nightmares are about Potter? He practically spits Harry's names. Not always, she whispers. Malfoy nods and then starts circling her. She doesn't move, doesn't twist her head to watch him prowl. Does Potter have nightmares where he calls out? She falters, unsure about this new direction. I don't know. It doesn't matter. He has his own issues that he's dealing with. So he's still got you wrapped around his finger. It'd be just like him to make everything about him still. Her eyes snapped his face. What? Or is it that you've wrapped yourself around Potter once again, your typical need to succumb to his every need? You don't know anything about us, anything about Harry. Don't I? He lets out a short laugh. anger twisting his face. That man has been there from the beginning of my fucking life, Granger. Before I could even formulate my own opinions or figure out who I was, I knew of Harry Potter. My own father mentioned his name more than I ever heard him say mine. He's been there from the first day of Hogwarts to the very last, somehow managing to crawl into my fucking life like a leech. Considering how things have ended up, I think I can say I have a pretty good idea of how Potter manages to have the entire world falling to his feet. The things he sacrificed were nothing compared to what everyone had to give up, she says incredulously. He deserves everything, all of it, and more. This is ridiculous. She shouldn't even entertain this conversation. Everyone gave up something, Granger. You would know that, wouldn't you? And yet you think you don't deserve the same recognition that he does. I don't care about any of it, she responds. She grips her wand until her knuckles turn white. I don't need the constant reminder that I did something that anyone would have done. Except not everyone did. Malfoy stops in front of her. Not everyone gave up everything as you did. He didn't have a choice. Fine, Potter didn't have a choice. His role in the war, his purpose for everything was all he knew from the beginning. But you did have a choice. You should have left the country, disappeared, but instead you chose to stay, to give up more than anyone should have asked you. If Hermione didn't know better, she'd think that Malfoy is backing her, trying to make her see his twisted truth of what she deserves. But she knows better, and she knows enough of this Malfoy. Even though she can understand where it might be rooted, she refuses to be a part of his need to belittle Harry. She won't ever do that to him. I'm not going to let you stand there and trivialize what everyone else has done, Malfoy. People gave up their lives for us, their future, so we could have one. Lupin, Tonks, Fred, his mother, she wants to say. Her voice cracks. A ball grows larger in her throat, and she shakes her head vehemently to clear it. I can't accept any of it. The reminders, the awards, nothing. None of it matters, especially when others didn't survive the war. He looks at her, drained. Nobody survived the war, Granger. The air is thick, and he takes another step toward her. Closing the heavy space between them, his eyes are hard, boring into her own. How can you stand there, he says quietly, and say you don't deserve the same things as him, and still testify for a fucking Death Eaters that should have been given the kiss? Heavy breaths shake her shoulders. Don't. But he ignores her, lowering his head further so that they're face to face. What would the families of Lavender Brown, Colin Creevey, or Jonathan Cresswell think if they found out that Hermione Granger didn't think Draco Malfoy deserved all the hate people gave him? Stop it, Malfoy, she pleads. She can't have this right now. Not like this. Do you think the families of Allison Toplin, Nigel Wolpert, would rejoice if they heard what you thought? Would they still celebrate you? Hermione gapes at him. Malfoy. What would Weasley say when he finds out his best friend thinks a Death Eater should be redeemed? She shoves him. He doesn't move a single inch, and she stares at him, stunned at what she's done. Her eyes fall to her hands and then to the ground as she tries to collect herself. He's right. They would hate her if they found out the things she kept to herself. Ron, Harry, everyone wouldn't understand a single thing or care to even begin to comprehend why it matters to her. She already knows this, has already brutalized herself with the guilt of her actions and beliefs. But in this moment, all she feels is fury at Malfoy for reminding her just how much she failed all those who she loves, that she doesn't deserve any of the goodness they show her. She swallows heavily and wraps her arms around her body, trembling with anger. Go on, he murmurs, coaxing her to look at him. Show me what you can do. She doesn't need to be told twice. She inhales sharply and shoves him. Again, there's no give as she slams her palms against his rigid body. He's one solid pillar of stone. She suspects her hands are hurting more than he is. Why won't you move? She exclaims as she tries again. His muscles tense under her hands with each shove, but he doesn't stumble a single step back. She pushes him. Malfoy grabs her wrist and holds her fist against his chest. She pants and looks up at him. She tries to pull away, but his firm grasp doesn't allow her to. A bead of water falls from his wet hair and down his nose. There are faster and easier ways to do this, Granger, he says wearily. He nods at her wand, resting uselessly on the ground. He lets go, and she staggers back before whipping her wand toward him. She shoots a stupefy, but he dodges it immediately, throwing a protective charm against him. Expelliarmus! He counters it, and she changes forward and throws a jinx. Levicorpus! She knows Malfoy's talented wizard, apt in battle, but she still groans in frustration as he counters every charm or jinx she throws at him. Her frustration grows when she realizes he's not sending any spells her way, only putting up shields. "Fight back!" she yells, swiping her wet hair away from her face. "Damn it, Malfoy, fight back!" She throws a stinging jinx. It barely grazes his leg, but the surprised look he shoots her shows he wasn't expecting her to do so. An approving smirk creeps across his mouth. He taps his wand against his other palm. "All right, Granger, now we're..." She sends a tripping jinx and he stumbles back. She watches with great satisfaction as he falls flat on his back in the mud. Locomoto Morris, his legs tied together. He raises his head, eyes bright with amusement, as she walks over to him. "I have to say, this is less than ideal." He steps over his body so that her legs are on either side of him. She goes down on one knee, balancing herself by placing a hand in the mud on her other side of him. "I've warned you, Malfoy. Do not tempt me. But you just don't listen, do you?" Malfoy rolled his eyes, dismissing her words without a passing thought. "All things considering, I'm not afraid of you, Granger." She pushes the tip of her wand against his throat. His eyes don't leave her face once, and she feels him stiffen as she leans towards him. "Oh, it's so tempting, ferret boy. One move, and you'd be roaming this earth with your tail between your legs." "You know what I think?" he asks, in a voice matching the low in hers. She presses her wand deeper. "What?" Malfoy doesn't so much as falter the smirk on his face. Instead, he inclines his head further, tipping it closer so that the wand digs into his skin. Hermione's eyes flick to his throat, captivated by the way it bobs as he speaks. "I think you spend too much time thinking about things that go between my legs." She scoffs and grips his chin. "You're an infant." He only laughs and it jolts her, the way his jaw muscles clench under her hand, how his chest shakes, letting some of the tension melt away. That's the second time she thinks, a proper, pure laugh, and it's just as astonishing as hearing it the first time. Her eyes lower down to his mouth, and he stops. Her eyes snag on the mud coating her hand that's gripping his face, and she stares at it intently, her heart beating fast in her ears. Her muddy thumb brushes against the edge of his lower lip, and she hesitates. Malfoy's chest is heaving heavily, and she feels his muscles contracting, relaxing beneath her. She doesn't look anywhere other than his lips, afraid that if she looks into his gray, she'd lose whatever it is that's guiding her now. She exhales, her breathing fanning across his face, and he shivers. The involuntary reaction makes her bold. Slowly, as though driven by an external force, she lifts her hand. She expects it to tremble, but it's as steady and confident as the first time Hermione ever raised a wand. She can feel him watching her as she brings her hand down near his forehead, and then ever so slowly slide it to his cheek, and then to his jaw. The movement leaves a streak of mud in its trail, and she hesitates for less than a second before sliding her thumb across his lips. They're soft as rose petals, and it takes all the will in her not to touch them again. She lifts her eyes then. He returns her gaze with such an intensity that she finds herself dipping her head lower. Her eyes fall back down to his parted lips, the mud already drying, but it's there. He's undeniably covered in mud. "And now," she wants to ask, "what do you think about me now, Malfoy?" He exhales as she inhales, or maybe it's the opposite, but she feels his warm breath against her face anyway, and it snaps her back to reality. She blinks, realizing that practically laying on top of Malfoy, and jerks back. He watches her silently, his steady eyes fixated on her as she stumbles to stand. Hermione mumbles a reversal spell over him and turns around, a hand on her throat to steady the thumping there. Malfoy shuffles behind her as he gets up. She walks away, shaking the hand she's touched his face with. "Where are you going? If you can always walk away, Malfoy, so can I." She doesn't look back as she vanishes into the troves of the trees. She doesn't know where she's going, just that she needs to get away from him and his questions. Dawn is a thread away from the blanket of night, and there's enough light to make out the trees. She winces when she steps on a stone and realizes with annoyance that she's still barefooted. There are footsteps behind her, predictably, but she doesn't bother slowing down. She wonders briefly what Malfoy was doing this late at night, alone outside in the rain, but her curiosity isn't enough this time for her to ask him. She pushes the wet curls plastered against her temple roughly away, mud squishing under her bare feet. Her knees feel bruised and the mud has stuck into her nail beds. She's not sure exactly what she's looking for, but somehow she manages to cross the boardwalk leading to the beach. Hermione pauses when her feet stumble onto the beach, her breath sweeping out of her chest as her toes sink into the sand. The wind whips across her face, wisping against her lashes, and she shivers. The tide crashes against the edge of the ocean, waves roaring as they snap across the jagged rocks. She feels dazed, unable to breathe, finds herself gulping for air despite it being everywhere around her and in her. It's all one tone of gray, the sand beneath her feet, the ocean spanning into the horizon, the storm clouds melting away as the sun slowly dares to peek out. She's never seen the ocean, she realizes. And the sheer vastness, the endlessness, terrifies her, and she wants to turn away, go back inside, because it's way too much. Everything is too much, and she can't handle it. We should go in. What? She's not really paying attention, her eyes narrowed on each wave that crashes against the shore. She feels herself being pulled in as her feet, then her ankles start to drown into the plunging ground. Malfoy comes up from behind her to her side. It looks nice to swim, don't you think? She doesn't turn her head to look at him. She's up to her knees now, into the water, into the sand, disappearing into the darkness. It's freezing. Are you afraid? His voice is low, taunting. When she doesn't answer, he turns to face her. Don't tell me you can't swim. I'm not going in, she says firmly. Perfect opportunity to wash off, in my opinion. It's an insane idea. You're insane. Certified by now, unfortunately, seeing as its guaranteed side effect of being around you for too long, although I'm sure there are other antidotes to fix that. Perhaps I'll do the world a favor and spend some of my expendable funds on figuring out one. A worthwhile investment, if you ask me. She eyes him suspiciously. What's the matter with you? Why are you so adamant all of a sudden? He doesn't answer her questions, and she thinks maybe he doesn't have one anyway. Perhaps it's all momentarily the spell of the night, the high of realizing that Hermione Granger is a mad woman, and he wants to humor her for the time being, to push her to see how far she can go until she shatters. You wanted space, Malfoy. You wanted distance. He jerks his head and mutters under his breath, too low for her to fully hear, too far. She watches him warily as he moves to stand in front of her. We could keep our shirts on, he offers quietly. It's a ridiculous notion considering she would never take her shirt up in front of Malfoy anyway, but she understands what he means. He keeps her gaze as she takes a step back, then two, before turning around completely and walking toward the water. He stops near the shore to tug at the laces of his boots and takes them off one at a time. He places his socks into the boots and aligns them neatly beside each other. He doesn't hesitate, doesn't falter as he gets in, stopping until the water is up to his waist, and turns back to her, silently waiting. His arms wade in the water, creating ripples that ebb and flow towards her, beckoning for her to come in. And maybe it's the combination of its already being a bizarre night, or maybe it's seeing Malfoy in the water as if he belongs there, the ocean behind him, because she finds herself moving toward him. She convinces herself that it doesn't mean anything. She's already on autopilot. It won't matter if she gives in this once. It's just water. It's just Malfoy. She doesn't stop to think when she reaches the tide and moves in until she's standing beside him, the water lapping up to her shoulders. It's not cold, surprisingly, warm enough that she's not shivering just yet. She lets out a shaky breath. He catches her eyes for a moment before ducking into the water. She watches his dark shadow blend into the dark cast, not noticing when a hand wraps around her ankle. She has 2 seconds to realize what's happening and to hold her breath before she's pulled down. Underwater, she turns around rapidly to find him. Though it's clear to see in front of her, the water is nothing but limitless and dark beneath her feet. There's a moment of frantic ticking in her heart when she can't find him, but then Malfoy swims in front of her, his white hair glowing as they wave in the water. The dried mud has melted away from his face, leaving his skin smooth and paler than usual, and she tries to glare at him, but she's transfixed at how the first light of dawn slants into the water to create a blurry halo around him. She can't do anything but watch him come closer. He hovers, watching her carefully before lifting his eyes around her. Bubbles rise to the surface as he reaches over and his fingers wrap around a strand of Hermione's curls. It's too soft, too gentle the way he brushes her hair between his fingers, and she has to pull away to the surface. There's a moment's pause, and then he breaks through as well. Malfoy runs both of his hands down his face and then up across his head, raking his white fringe out of his face. She stands awkwardly, unknowingly what to do now that he's gotten her into the water. She ends up staring at him. taking in the droplets on his eyelashes and the way a streak of water drips down his cheek and jaw before disappearing into the collar of his shirt. Her eyes drift even lower, catching the way his wet shirt sticks against his lean, languid body. He might as well not be wearing his shirt, considering she can practically see the exact definition of his body, all the rough edges and lines, and the way his skin smooths over the muscle. She finds herself wondering if he still plays Quidditch. Surely his body has to come from him working for it. Malfoy makes a sound at the back of his throat, redirecting her back to his face, and she realizes he's been staring back at her. He raises a brow at her. She's suddenly aware of all the places her own shirt is sticking to her body and the horrifying fact that she didn't wear a bra to sleep. She's tempted to cover her chest with her arms, but his eyes never drop any lower than her face, and she suspects the movement will only draw more attention. She flushes and turns her back to him. She cups a hand through the water and watches it slip between her fingers. Clearing her throat, she says, "I've never been to the ocean before, have you?" "Yes." She feels his voice more than she hears it. The water ripples behind her as he comes closer. "Right, of course. I'm sure with all the family holidays you've seen more than just the ocean. I've never been to the ocean, though." She's stammering, repeating words, saying nonsensical sentences. She scratches her forehead to distract herself from how close he feels behind her. Not that it's any different from the sea, which I have seen. Mind you, Fleur and Bill's cottage is at the coast of the Celtic Sea. A beautiful home, really. Her heart clenches painfully at the last memories of the cottage. But at the end of the day, water is just water. Eventually you realize it doesn't matter what the size of something is when it all feels the same. "I can think of a few things where size does matter, Granger," he drawls. Heat blooms across her face. "Did you know that less than 5% of the world's oceans have been discovered? How mad is that, to realize that magic, in all its capabilities and natural advancement, still hasn't found a way to explore what else is in the ocean? What do you think is the remaining 95%? Fish." His shoulder touches hers briefly as he wades in front of her. Hermione quickly turns in another direction, looking out into the horizon where light is breaking through the storm clouds. He gives her a strange look, but she pushes on, unable to stop herself. I guess eventually, even for explorers, the mystery behind what they discover fades away. You start looking for something else, become hungry for new discoveries, go find a new planet, and start from the beginning just for the sake of novelty and the vanity of being the first. Did you know that the first wizard, William Wardman, to ever go into the ocean expedition was actually not a man? It was his wife, Elizabeth Warden, who used Polyjuice Potion to become her husband because there were societal restrictions that prevented witches from joining the crew. Why do you know so much useful information, Granger? It's a miracle you haven't suffered a stroke from the sheer force of using your head. She scowls. It's a miracle you haven't suffered a stroke from the sheer weight of your head, Malfoy, considering how self-absorbed you are. You can't use my words to insult me. I can, and I think I was rather effective, especially since I'm positive whatever's left of your brain contains only thoughts about your stupid shiny hair, a practically fluorescent mirror ball. Shiny hair? Or how tall you are, always towering over everyone like a bloody tree. What's a mirror ball? Crouching under doors, looking at yourself in mirrors as if it's some sort of sport. It sounds like you're the one who's been looking, Granger. Always writing in that bloody journal of yours like a starved writer with an overdue rent. You're talking too much, Malfoy glides in front of her. Why are you talking so much? You make me nervous, she admits, catching her breath. He bites the inside of his lip. Really? But like a normal amount of nervousness, she hurriedly explains. Like how someone would be nervous around a mosquito. Like, I have to prepare myself in case you bite me. Bite you? I mean, of course you're not going to bite me. But I have to be careful anyways, because you might. He hums. All right, Granger. She glares at him for a moment before lowering her eyes to the water. The ripples with her movement combine with the ones around Malfoy. She hovers her palm above the water. You know their names. She doesn't need to clarify, but in his hesitancy, she's sure he knows what she means. His voice is terse. Yes. She looks up. You know all of them? He nods once and shifts gaze averted. She wants to ask why, but the tension in his face is replaced with curiosity and he opens his mouth before she can. Where do you go? What? You get this look sometimes, like you're far away, like you're here but you're not really here. You're somewhere there, Where do you go? She blinks, stunned. He must notice the shock on her face because he lifts a passive shoulder as if he hasn't just tilted everything. You've always been there, Granger. She shivers at the tone in his voice. Malfoy comes closer. Are you cold? No, she breathes. I could help you with occlumency. Why? He looked down to the water. I went too far. It's not an apology, not even close. She's also not sure exactly which of his actions he's referring to, considering everything that's happened. But her pulse quickens at the idea that she might finally learn the damn thing. And she's not surprised that it's enough for her to accept this olive branch from him. She needs this more than he thinks she does. She won't be trapped by her mind, and while it won't solve everything, it's a start. Besides, if she gets lucky, she might be able to do it better than him. Who taught you? His eyes avoid hers as they lift to the tree behind her. My aunt. Bellatrix. Hermione knew from Harry that Bellatrix was a skilled occlumens and legilimens, having learnt directly from Voldemort. She remembers the things Malfoy told her in the kitchen, and she shudders at the thought of being trained by someone as ruthless and unforgiving as her. What kind of stain did that leave behind? There are too many questions in her mind that she wants to address, but his closed-off face suggests he won't answer any of them. She tries anyways. Was it difficult for you to learn? Nothing's difficult for me, Granger. She rolls her eyes. Are you going to teach me how she taught you? No, he says sharply, and Hermione flinches. He adds carefully, you wouldn't want that. She definitely doesn't want it, or anything more that is a remnant of her. Right, no, of course. Malfoy clears his throat. How much do you know about occlumency? Hermione tries to recollect the passages she's read. I know there are two parts to it. First, finding a center, and then second, using the center to store away the information of the mind. I've just never gotten the chance to practice or see if what I was doing was right. Close your eyes. She stares. What, now? You want to start now? I thought you'd be eager to jump in. I don't know. You're afraid. Am not, she replies hotly. She pushes her limp hair over her shoulder. I just don't think I can do it right now. It's not the right environment. I feel like I need to be somewhere warm and comfortable and have some tea with me, preferably in front of the fireplace. A blanket would be nice. Hufflepuff. She gasps, narrowing her eyes. Don't you dare. You really think you're going to go about life warm and comfortable with some Earl Grey nearby whenever you need to oculate? She scowls, and he gives her a pointed look. He's right. Not that she'd let him know. Fine. This should be perfectly okay. Freezing to death shouldn't interfere with the process. Malfoy ignores her. Obviously, we won't be able to cover everything, and you won't require my assistance anyways once you get the basics. I could help you to see if your wall is proactive and strong, but most of the practice is on your own once you get the basics. She nods slowly, suddenly, feeling anxious and exposed. Right. Okay. He takes another step closer. We don't have to do this if you don't want me to. He's asking her to be vulnerable, to let the guard down and let him in, and it's terrifying thought. Talking about things close to her is nothing like letting her mental walls down around him. Her mind, however fractured, is the one thing she relies on. It's strange, and she'd never think that they'd end up like this, but it's something. He's offering her something to protect herself with. Didn't she want this? For them to trust each other? No, I do. And because she doesn't sound as confident as she'd like, she closes her eyes before she can think twice and stop herself. What are you feeling right now? He's right in front of her. She can feel the heat radiating off his body. Nervous. And anxious. They're the same things, Granger. Then move back a little, she suggests, and is surprised when he does. Now, she shakes her head once, getting frustrated at her own inability. Still anxious. Don't focus too much on the emotion. It's important for the identification, but after that, all of the steps follow a similar trajectory. It's kind of hard not to when it's completely taking over me. I know. That's the whole point of occlumency. Using a shield to protect yourself from unstable emotions. But if you focus on the negative emotions, you'll cage yourself within them. You need to distract your attention to something else, another stimulus around you, and focus on that. She nods slowly, trying to follow along. Good. What do you hear? You? His voice is traced with amusement. And? The wind, but it's choppy. Okay, what else? The ocean. She shudders and takes a deep breath. It's loud. Focus on that. It's too much. It makes me think of other things. You're safe, Granger. Her breath hitches, and she wants to forget about oculating and ask him what he means. Instead, she shakes her head. I don't think I can. Try. It can be terrifying, but you can try and change it to something that can clear your mind. It won't happen right away. Occlumency takes a lot of practice and discipline. I am disciplined. You are, he agrees, and she raises a brow at that, almost opens her eyes to see for herself whether he's joking or serious. But it takes time and mental effort, and it becomes exhausting forcing yourself to turn inwards. It's not easy, but you can start with one thing first. She pauses, considering. Okay, I'll focus on the ocean. Focus on the sound, feel it surround you, then take a deep breath, in through your mouth, and exhale through your nose. She opens her eyes and looks him deadpan. I know how to breathe, Malfoy. Both of his hands rise and hover near her face as if to hold her head and force her to listen, as she'd do with Ron, but he lowers them immediately. He gives her an exaggerated, annoyed look instead. Granger. She twists her mouth, stopping herself from smiling at how serious he's taking this. Fine. Breathing. Focus on the sound of the waves and the way it gets louder as it comes closer and then quieter. And then follow the same pattern with your breathing. She does what he says, trying to hone in the sound. It's difficult, and she wants to give up entirely and go inside. She's struck again by the oddity of learning something academic and skilled from Malfoy. In Hogwarts, while he'd always compete with Harry on everything, academics were where Malfoy competed with her. They were rivals in everything, and it's strange enough that he's now an ocean away, teaching her one thing she'd never been able to do. He wonders if he realizes this and wonders what shifted from the conversation in the kitchen. He seemed so desperate then, tried to convince her of something that she still doesn't know. What had changed from then and now, she wonders. What has he resigned himself to? You're thinking too much? I can't help it. Shut it off, Granger. None of it is important right now. Telling Hermione to stop thinking is the same as telling her to stop breathing. She contemplates telling him that her conversation to herself about him is very much important considering he's in her space right now, but she exhales and straightens herself, jumping back into the breathing and the ocean. It takes her a few minutes, and while she's finding herself circling back to Malfoy and the fact that he's standing in the ocean with him, she manages a good minute where all she does is breathe and listen. She ends up in a meditating stance, so that when he speaks up again, she doesn't startle. Instead, his low voice seems to be a reverberation in her chest, an echo traveling through time and distance into her blood and bones. How are you feeling? Far, she whispers. Okay, keep breathing. The second part requires you to conjure up an image of some kind for storage of your emotions, memories, and thoughts. Try a box. Hermione tries to visualize a box, opening the lid and peering inside, but she feels the constriction in her throat, the tightness of space clenching her stomach. Too small, she gasps. Okay, something else. His echo disappears and he pauses to think. Try a house. Hermione frowns, conjuring up a house. At first, it's too small. She's barely able to crouch through the door, but she steadies her breath and opens the front door, thinks of how tall Malfoy is, and makes it a little higher than that. She walks into the corridor of the house, her footsteps echoing around her, and gently closes the door behind her. Her breathing eases with each step inside, and she nods in confirmation, and he must see the tension in her body dissipating because he continues. Now add rooms to your house. Each room can be designated for something you value in your life, something you want to protect, and anything else that you'd want to store away. She waits in the corridor, closing her eyes and then reopening them as the doors appear around her. She goes to the first one. When she opens it, she finds herself in the middle of a room with her friends. Harry sits beside Ron, laughing at something Ginny has said, who sits across from them on the couch. Her fingers run through Luna's hair, who sits on her knees on the ground. Ginny says something that is indecipherable to Hermione, and it creates a pang in her heart. It's a familiar memory, one she recognizes from the night at Ginny's apartment. However, other than her friends, the room itself is white and empty. She's unsure what she needs to do with this memory of them or what the next step is now that she has them in a room. She turns to Harry, who says something, and everyone laughs once more. Walking closer to him, Hermione lowers her face to his eye level. He talks right through her, gesturing with his hand about something and nodding at Ron. He looks as young as he did during the war, but without all the strain of that time. His black hair flops against his skin, covering his scar just how he likes to keep it. His skin is youthful and glowing, not yet hollowed out by the stress and grief. His glasses are whole and unscratched. His eyes are bright, twinkling with sheer peace. She wonders why she's thought of him from the war, despite the memory only being 3 or 4 years old. Seeing him like this, a fragment of the war, yet somehow laughing, shakes her. She wants to wrap her arms around him, grip him tightly to her chest, and convince herself that it's possible. He can be like this, regardless of what the war has taken from them. He is like this. She raises a heavy hand, cups his cheeks, taken aback when she meets his solid skin. It's a memory, but it's everything she'd hoped for him during the war. And it feels so real. Harry continues to laugh, but then, as though he too can feel her hand, he leans into her cupped palm and green eyes lift to meet hers. Hermione gasps, eyes wide. She freezes as he reaches to place his own hand over hers. He'd never let her touch like this. It's a tender gesture, and she wants to weep. "You're in my head," she rasps. "It's not real." "Of course I'm in your head, Hermione," Harry says softly, "but why should that mean that it's not real?" Hermione makes a choked sound. Somewhere far away, Malfoy whispers, "I think we should stop now. That's enough practice." She doesn't listen. She creates another door in the same room she's in right now, deciding Harry needs a separate room. She opens the door and peeks inside, and Harry pops up in the middle of the room, and she smiles at her. "Granger, open your eyes." She's too far. He's too far. His echoing voice even further away. "Granger." His tone is firm, and the echo transitions to something stronger and closer. But she's too busy walking through her house, closing doors and opening others, labeling them all. "You have to come back." Her eyes flutter rapidly under her closed lids. She reaches for the knob when a bucket of water pours down on her. Hermione gasps, eyes whipping open. She sputters as Malfoy slams his arm against the water, sending another wave towards her. "Malfoy!" She shields herself with her arms. "Stop!" He pauses for less than a second, and then another tide, and she exclaims, wiping her face. "I'm fine, Malfoy." "Just for good measure," he replies simply. She pushes her wet hair from her face. That was unnecessary. He studies her with furrowed brows. "You can't go too deep at once. It requires practice and patience, and even then it's not advisable to do it during your first run. If you go too deep into yourself, it's difficult to come back out." Hermione exhales a long breath, and she thinks of Harry, and while it's still a memory, it doesn't linger. She feels the memory still, but it doesn't stay. Her chest feels lighter, and she looks up at Malfoy. "Thank you, Malfoy." He doesn't respond, doesn't even acknowledge it. He doesn't ask her what she was thinking of or what memories she chose, and she doesn't think she'd tell him anyways. Instead, they stand in front of each other unspeaking. It feels as though things have shifted, or maybe nothing has changed except for a restoration of balance between them. "We should go back," he says, eventually. She doesn't trust herself to speak, so she nods, and she can't move either, so he's the first to step back and make his way to the shore. "Malfoy," she calls. He stops halfway and turns to look at her over his shoulder. "I didn't want to die." It's the truth. It's always been the truth. One she's fought for before, during, and after the war. His face is neutral, but she notes something pass across his eyes, and then he nods once before turning back around. She watches him for a little longer as he gets out, water dripping from his sharp angles, to put his boots back on. Only when his receding back disappears into the trees does she follow him out of the water, feet stepping into the prints of his. Dawn has broken out across the sky, letting sunbeams through the clouds that reflect off of the water like glistening spilled oil. The waves are loud, but amongst the chaos, Hermione can make out the cacophony of the birds waking up. Everything around them continues, untouched and undisturbed. The worst of the storm is over. And that's the end of chapter 12. This was a good one. Yeah, it's crazy. I loved the in-depth occlumency lesson. That was super. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, this is probably my favorite chapter so far. Tell me, guys, what do you think?